My name is Renata Osei, and I was 34 years old the morning I handed over the keys to the only home I had ever truly built, and I did it on purpose. Before I explain what I mean by that, let me tell you who I am. I spent 11 years as a title examiner for Caldwell County Abstract in Hargrove, Ohio. My job was to read property records the way other people read novels, slowly, looking for the thing the author didn't want you to find. I had caught forged signatures, undisclosed liens, boundary disputes that went back to the 1940s, and one very memorable deed restriction that prohibited the sale of alcohol on a parcel that later became a wine bar. I was good at it. I was not the kind of woman who signed documents without reading them first, which is why what happened that Tuesday in Judge Alcorn's courtroom looked, to every person watching, like surrender. And why my mother, sitting in the third row with her hands folded in her lap and a paper grocery bag on the bench beside her, didn't say a word when I picked up the pen. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where the quietest signature in the room sometimes carries the loudest consequence. The paper grocery bag is where this story really starts. My mother had brought it from her house on Fenwick Road the night before, setting it on my kitchen table without explanation. Inside was a manila folder, and inside the folder were two documents I had never seen. She didn't tell me what they meant that night. She just said, "Read the second page first." I read it. Then I read it again. Then I sat down at that kitchen table and understood, for the first time in 14 months of a divorce that had cost me most of my savings and all of my sleep, that we were not losing. I am going to tell you everything. But I need you to understand where we started before I can show you where we ended. The house was on Crestline Drive in a small town called Millhaven, 20 minutes outside of Hargrove. My ex-husband, Desmond, and I had bought it in the 4th year of our marriage for $218,400. It was a craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch and a furnace that needed replacing. We replaced it. We also replaced the roof, the gutters, the kitchen floor, and the main bathroom. We did most of it ourselves on weekends, with a cordless drill that kept losing its charge. By the time Desmond filed for divorce, the house had been appraised at $379,500. His attorney argued that because the down payment had come from his family, a fact that was technically true, the equity belonged primarily to him. My attorney said we could fight it. Desmond's mother, Pauline, said we couldn't. Pauline is the person I need you to understand. Pauline Adeyemi had a way of delivering bad news that made it sound like care. She was 61 years old, a retired school administrator from Brixton Township, and she used the vocabulary of concern the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with precision, without warmth, and always leaving a mark. When Desmond first told her we were separating, she drove to my house with a casserole and told me, over my own kitchen table, that she had always worried I wasn't ready for marriage. She said it the way you'd tell someone their slip was showing, as if she were doing me a favor. The coffee sat cooling between us. I set my hands flat on my own table and did not say anything. The structural reason for Pauline's behavior, which I didn't understand until much later, was this. Desmond was her only child, and she had financed his life so thoroughly that losing any part of it felt like losing a part of herself. She had provided the down payment on the house. She had co-signed his first car loan. She had paid for 2 years of graduate school he never finished. Every dollar she had given him was in her private accounting, a dollar she was still owed, and I was the person standing between her son and a clean ledger. I don't say this to excuse what she did. I say it because the formula for that kind of cruelty is almost always the same. It isn't malice for its own sake. It's a debt someone decided you owe them without ever telling you. My mother, Dorothea, was the opposite of Pauline in nearly every way. She was quiet where Pauline was fluent. She worked the front desk at Hargrove County Deeds and Records, a job she had held for 22 years, which meant she knew every property clerk, every filing protocol, and every obscure attachment category in Caldwell County's record system by first name and function. She had never once told me this was an advantage. She just showed up when I needed her. The paper grocery bag she brought me the night before the hearing had been sitting in her filing cabinet at home for 4 years. Inside was a document she had quietly prepared with the help of a property attorney named Gerald Hutchins, whose office was above the laundromat on Sable Street. The document was a restrictive covenant, a private land use restriction attached to the deed of the Crestline Drive property at the time of its original transfer into Desmond's and my joint names. It had been recorded at the county level on the same day as the deed, filed as a secondary attachment, and it stipulated that the property could not be sold, transferred, or refinanced without the written consent of both named parties, or their designated successor. My mother was the designated successor. The covenant was not illegal. It was not hidden in any fraudulent sense. It had been recorded in plain sight in the public record, document number CR 4471-B, available to anyone who pulled the full title chain. Desmond's attorney had pulled a standard deed summary. He had not pulled the full chain. This is the thing about property records that most people don't understand. The deed is not the whole story. The deed is the headline. The attachments are the article. I had known this for 11 years. I just hadn't known my mother knew it too. There is a yellow legal pad that I have kept since the first month of our marriage. I started it as a habit from work. I used to take notes during title searches, writing down every document number, every grantor, every flag. After we bought the house on Crestline Drive, I started using it to track the things Desmond and I were building together. Not finances exactly, just a record. 47 pages of specifics. The date we replaced the furnace, what it cost, who installed it. The weekend we retiled the bathroom, just the two of us, in November, because we couldn't afford to hire anyone. The afternoon I repainted the entire front porch by myself because Desmond had a work trip and the weather was closing in. I still have that pad. The cover is water-stained from a leak we fixed in the 3rd year. I kept it not because I planned to use it in a legal proceeding, but because it was the closest thing I had to proof that the house was mine in every way that didn't show up in a title search. I brought it to the hearing in my bag, under the folder my mother had given me. The 14 months between Desmond filing and that Tuesday hearing had not been quiet. In the first 2 weeks after he filed, I hired a licensed appraiser named Sandra Voke to document every improvement we had made to the property since the purchase date, a process that took 3 visits and produced a 40-page itemized report. For 6 months following the appraisal, I paid the mortgage, the utilities, and the property tax on a house I was no longer allowed to sleep in because Desmond's attorney had argued that his client needed stability during proceedings, and the judge had agreed on a temporary basis. During those same 6 months, I drove to Hargrove County Deeds and Records every other Thursday after work, sometimes until the office closed at 5. Pulling the complete title chain on our property myself, which is how I eventually found document number CR 4471-B. In the 4th month of proceedings, I paid Gerald Hutchins $1,850 to review the covenant and confirm it had been validly recorded and that it would survive a title transfer. For 8 months, I kept a separate spreadsheet logging every maintenance call, every repair invoice, and every tax payment I had made on the property, with dates and dollar amounts, a record I gave to my attorney, who called it the most organized document she had received from a client in her 12 years of family law practice. In the 9th month, I sat in my car outside the courthouse on Meridian Avenue for 40 minutes before a deposition, reading the covenant language one more time, because I needed to be certain I understood every clause before anyone asked me a question under oath. For the full 14 months, I continued working at Caldwell County Abstract without telling a single colleague what was happening at home, because the work required a steady hand, and I had learned long ago that compartmentalization was a form of competence. In the 10th month, I paid $614 to have a surveyor confirm the exact legal description on the Crestline Drive deed matched the covenant's property description, a detail that would have voided the covenant's applicability if it hadn't aligned. In the 12th month, I requested and reviewed every recorded instrument touching the Crestline Drive parcel since 1987, 7 documents in total, each pulled and cross-referenced against the covenant's legal description over the course of 2 evenings at the kitchen table, so that when anyone asked whether I had read the full chain, I would be able to say yes and mean it without qualification. In the 13th month, I drove to Gerald Hutchins' office on Sable Street a second time, unscheduled, without an appointment, and asked him to walk me through every scenario in which the covenant could be challenged on procedural grounds. We spent 2 hours going through them. There were 4 plausible arguments. He had drafted around all 4. I wrote down every one with his counterpoint for each, and I kept those notes in the manila folder beside the covenant itself, so that if anyone raised those arguments in a room where I was sitting, I would not need to think. I would already know. During the final 6 weeks before the hearing, I met with my attorney, Claire Donahue, every Tuesday evening in her office above the insurance agency on Porter Street, going over every scenario. What Desmond's attorney would argue, what the judge might ask, and what would happen the moment anyone read the second page of the deed package we were preparing to submit. For 11 years before any of this began, I had spent 40 hours a week reading documents that other people signed without fully understanding, and I had never once thought that skill would matter, most not at work, but in a courtroom in my own county, on a Tuesday morning, signing away a house I already knew I was keeping. The night before the hearing, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table and watched me read the covenant for what was probably the 15th time. She didn't say it would be fine. She didn't tell me not to worry. She just reached across and set her hand over mine for a moment, the way she used to when I was small and couldn't sleep. I thought about that yellow legal pad. 47 pages of a life I had built room by room, repair by repair, winter by winter. Proof that a house is not a deed. A deed is just paper. What makes something yours is what you put into it when no one was keeping score. Pauline had been keeping score her whole life. That was precisely why she had never learned to read the fine print. The morning of the hearing, I arrived at the Caldwell County Courthouse on Meridian Avenue at 8:14. It was a Tuesday, overcast, the kind of February cold that settles in your chest. I was wearing my work blazer and the flat shoes I wear when I need to stand for a long time. I had the folder in my bag and the legal pad beside it, and I had not slept more than 3 hours. My mother was already there when I walked in. She was sitting in the third row with a paper grocery bag on the bench beside her, and when I sat down next to her, she squeezed my hand once, briefly, and said nothing.
I didn't need her to say anything.
At 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, Judge Alcorn called our case. Desmond sat at the opposite table with his attorney. Pauline was in the second row directly behind him, wearing a cream blouse and the expression she always wore when she was certain of the outcome. When the moment came, I signed where they asked me to sign. I set the pen down. I folded my hands. Desmond's attorney stacked the papers and smiled at his client. Outside the courthouse, on the steps, Pauline laughed, a short, certain sound, the kind that doesn't need an audience. My mother squeezed my hand a second time and said nothing. They hadn't read the second page. I should tell you how we got to that courtroom, because the signing was the end of something that had started long before Desmond filed any paperwork. We had been married for 9 years when things began to shift. Not dramatically. Not with a single event I could point to and say, there, that was the moment.
It was quieter than that.
It was the way Pauline started appearing at our house on Crestline Drive without calling first. The way she began referring to the guest bedroom as Desmond's old room, as though he had never left. The way she would walk through our kitchen and open cabinets and say things like, "I always thought this layout was a little impractical," in the tone of someone who had simply noticed a fact rather than delivered a verdict. Desmond didn't correct her. He never corrected her. In 9 years of marriage, I had learned that his silence in those moments was not neutrality. It was permission. The first real confrontation happened on a Sunday in October, 2 years before he filed. We were having dinner, just the three of us, which was already unusual because Pauline rarely accepted invitations without reshaping them into something she had organized herself. She had brought food without being asked, a full pot of stew, a loaf of bread, a container of rice. She set it all out on our table as though she were catering an event, and then she sat down and said, while passing the bread to Desmond, "I've been thinking it might be time to talk about the house." I set my fork down. "What about it?" I said. "Well," she said, and she smiled the way she always smiled when she was about to say something she had already decided could not be argued with. "The neighborhood has appreciated significantly. And with Desmond's new position, I just think there are options worth discussing." "Options," I said. "A larger home. Something with more room to grow." She looked at me briefly, then back at Desmond. "Somewhere with a better school district, perhaps. For the future." There was a silence after that. The stew was still steaming. The bread sat untouched in my hands. I didn't answer her. I set the bread down and picked up my fork and finished eating. Desmond said, "It's something to think about," and Pauline smiled again, and that was that. Afterwards, when she had gone and Desmond was washing dishes, I stood in the doorway of the kitchen and asked him what she meant. "She's just thinking ahead," he said, without turning around. "It's our house," I said. "I know that," he said. But the way he said it, quietly, facing the sink, told me he wasn't entirely sure anymore. I watched him work the dish brush around the edge of the pot she had brought. The stew had been good. That was the thing about Pauline, the food was always good. She understood that generosity of that kind disarmed people, made it harder to say what needed to be said. "Has she talked to you about this before?" I asked. He set the pot in the rack. "She mentions things sometimes." "What kinds of things?" He picked up a glass. "The neighborhood. Values. She found some comparable sales data online." I set my shoulder against the doorframe. "She found comparable sales data online," I said. "She's just interested," he said. "She's always been interested in real estate." "Desmond," I said, "comparable sales data is not something you look up because you're interested in real estate in the abstract. It's something you look up when you're building a case." He set the glass in the rack and didn't say anything. "I'm telling you what I see," I said, "because I read documents for a living and what I'm seeing is a person who is building a file. I don't know what she intends to do with it, but I am telling you now so that you know, and so that later you cannot say I didn't." He dried his hands on the dish towel. He turned around and looked at me. "She means well," he said. "I know she does," I said. "That's what I keep telling myself." I went to bed before he did that night. He came in late and lay down without waking me, or tried not to. I lay still in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about comparable sales data and a pot of stew and the way Pauline smiled when she said, "for the future," and I thought, I should write this down. I got up at 2 in the morning and went downstairs and wrote it in the legal pad. Date. Subject. What was said. What wasn't said. That dinner was the first crack. What followed over the next 18 months was less a collapse than an erosion. Pauline began calling Desmond directly with suggestions about the property, contractors she knew, a real estate agent she trusted, comparable sales in the county. Desmond relayed these conversations to me in summary, stripped of her tone, sanded down until they sounded like neutral information rather than a campaign. I started keeping notes on the yellow legal pad. Not to be suspicious. Just because I was a person who kept notes, and something in my professional instinct had begun to tick. The second confrontation came 6 months before Desmond filed. He had told me on a Thursday evening that he thought we should talk. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I came home from work, which was unusual. He was normally in his office until 7. There was a folder on the table in front of him. "Pauline had some paperwork drawn up," he said. "Just a proposal." I sat down across from him. "What kind of proposal?" "A buyout structure," he said. "Since she provided the original down payment, she and her attorney think there's a reasonable argument for partial equity." I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. "Her attorney," I said. "She just wanted it formalized," he said. "It's not adversarial." I looked at his face. His jaw was set in the way it always set when he had already agreed to something, and was now explaining it to me as though it were still a discussion. "Desmond," I said, "I have spent 11 years reading documents that people signed without understanding them. I am not signing that folder." He pushed it slightly toward me. "Nobody's asking you to sign anything tonight. She just wants us to consider." "Who paid the mortgage for 9 years?" I said. He was quiet. "Who replaced the furnace?" I said. "Who retiled the bathroom? Who painted the porch in November because the weather was closing in and you were in Columbus?" He looked at the table. "Every time something broke," I said, "I was the one who called. Every time something cost money we didn't have, I was the one who worked out how to cover it." 11 years, Desmond. That is not upkeep. That is a house. He said nothing. He looked at the folder on the table between us the way he had begun to look at everything in that last year, as though he were waiting for someone else to decide what it meant. "She's trying to protect me," he said, finally. "I know she is," I said. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." He looked up. "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant," I said. You meant she loves you, and she's looking out for your interests, and the down payment was real money, and that counts for something. All of that is true. And none of it changes what I just said. He was quiet for a moment. The folder sat between us on the table, squared off at the edges, the way Warren Fitch's assistant had probably squared it off before Pauline drove it over. "What do you want me to do?" he said. I looked at him. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the folder. He had the expression he wore when he was genuinely asking, not performing the question, but actually asking it. I had not seen that expression in months, and seeing it then made something in my chest press flat, and still. "I want you to put that folder in the recycling bin," I said. "And I want you to call your mother tomorrow and tell her that the house is ours and we are not renegotiating the terms of our own marriage." He looked at the folder. "Desmond," I said. He looked up. "I can't do this for you," I said. That's the part she's never understood. I can build things. I can fix things. I can document everything we have and everything we've done and put it in a file that will hold up in any courtroom in this county. But I cannot decide, for you, whose side you're on. He didn't say anything to that. I stood up, left the folder where it was, and went upstairs. He didn't follow me. The house was quiet in the way houses are when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. That was the last real conversation we had before the lawyers entered. When Desmond filed 4 months later, the petition listed the house as a primary asset and cited Pauline's down payment as grounds for a disproportionate equity claim. His attorney was a man named Warren Fitch, who wore the kind of suit that communicates confidence without effort and who had, according to Claire, a reputation for running standard discovery on deed summaries and stopping there. The first time I sat across from Warren Fitch in a deposition room, he asked me whether I had any documentation supporting my claim to equity beyond the standard marital contribution argument. "I have 47 pages, I said. He smiled in the way people smile when they want to appear unbothered. "We'll review whatever you submit." He reviewed the appraisal and the maintenance records. He did not request a full title chain. Claire had anticipated this, and we did not volunteer it. The deposition lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Pauline was not present, but her influence was, in the framing of every question, in the assumption embedded in each line of inquiry that the house had been Desmond's to give and mine to receive, rather than something we had built together with my hands as much as his name. Warren Fitch had a way of asking questions that made facts sound like interpretations. He asked about the down payment 6 different ways: as a gift, as a loan, as an investment, as a foundational contribution, as a family arrangement, as a matter of historical record. Each reframing was designed, I understood, to see which version I would accept. I accepted none of them. The down payment was a gift from Desmond's mother to Desmond, I said, the first time he asked. It appears in the mortgage documentation as such. That is the historical record. "And your understanding of the terms of that gift at the time?" he asked. "My understanding was that it was a gift," I said. "Not a loan. Not a partial equity claim. A gift. If there were other terms, they were not communicated to me at the time of purchase and are not reflected in any document I was asked to sign." He moved on. He came back to it, differently worded. "Did you and your husband ever discuss the possibility that the down payment might be returned to Mrs. Adeyemi in the event of a sale?" "No," I said. "Did Mrs. Adeyemi ever express an expectation of repayment?" "Not in my presence," I said. "Not in terms I would characterize as an expectation." "How would you characterize it?" I looked at him. "She expressed opinions about the property on a regular basis," I said. "The nature of those opinions evolved over time. I would not describe any of them as legally operative." He wrote something down. I watched his pen move. "Ms. Osei," he said, without looking up, "would you characterize your contributions to the property as primary or supplemental to your husband's?" "I would characterize them as documented," I said. He looked up. 47 pages, I said. "You have the appraisal. You have the maintenance logs. You have the tax payment records. If you want to characterize them, the documentation will support whatever characterization the math supports." He moved on to the next question. Afterward, in the hallway, I passed Pauline on the way to the elevator. She was waiting for Desmond outside the deposition room. When she saw me, she tilted her head slightly and said, "You're handling this with a lot of grace, Renata."
I mean that.
I looked at her for a moment. My throat tightened, slow and certain, like a knot being pulled from both ends. "Thank you, Pauline," I said. I got in the elevator. The doors closed. I stared at the floor numbers and breathed through my nose and did not cry until I was in my car in the parking structure on Meridian Avenue, and even then it was brief and silent because I had a deposition summary to review before 6 o'clock. The mediation session 3 months later was where the structure of their argument became fully visible. Warren Fitch presented a tidy narrative. Pauline had provided the foundational capital. Desmond had carried the primary mortgage obligation. My contributions, while acknowledged, were categorized as maintenance and upkeep, a phrase that made 11 years of physical labor sound like dusting. The mediator, a patient woman named Diane Cho, asked me whether I wanted to respond. "Not at this stage," I said.
Claire looked at me.
I looked at Diane Cho. Desmond looked at his hands. Pauline, sitting beside Warren Fitch, touched the pearls at her throat and said, "We really do want this to be fair to everyone." There was a silence that sat in the room like something heavy. I wrote the date in the margin of my legal pad. Diane Cho looked at Claire. "Is your client open to discussing the parameters of the equity split?" "We're here to listen," Claire said. Warren Fitch leaned forward slightly. "The foundational contribution is documented. The down payment was $43,000, which in the current valuation represents a significant percentage of the initial equity basis. We believe that context is relevant to any equitable distribution." "The foundational contribution," I said, without looking up from the legal pad, "is one-line item in a 40-page document." Warren Fitch looked at me. "Ms. Osei, the appraisal your attorney submitted documents improvements, yes. But the structure itself. The roof," I said. "The furnace. The gutters. The kitchen floor. The bathroom tile. The front porch. The drainage issue along the east foundation wall that we caught in the second winter because I noticed the grade was wrong."
I set down my pen.
"Those are improvements. The down payment bought us a bungalow with a bad furnace. The 11 years bought us the house that appraised at $379,000. Pauline's hand moved from the pearls to the table. "Renata," she said, and her voice had the texture of someone managing a difficult conversation with enormous patience. "No one is diminishing what you contributed. We're simply trying to establish an equitable framework." "I appreciate that," I said. And I picked up my pen and wrote another line in the margin of the legal pad. Warren Fitch then proposed a settlement figure. Desmond would receive the house and its equity, and I would receive a payment of $41,200, a number he described as representing my proportional marital contribution after Pauline's foundational capital was factored. I wrote $41,200 in my legal pad and underlined it twice. "We'll consider it," Claire said. We did not consider it. What we did instead, over the following 6 weeks, was prepare the full deed package. Claire worked with Gerald Hutchins to assemble the complete chain of title documentation, the original deed, every recorded instrument in sequence, and filed as the final attachment, exactly as it had been recorded 4 years earlier, document CR 4471B. Claire asked me, the night before the hearing, whether I was certain I wanted to give them the house. "I'm not giving them the house," I said. "I'm giving them the paperwork. There's a difference." She looked at me for a moment. "Walk me through that difference," she said. "The paperwork is a deed summary," I said. "It's accurate as far as it goes. What it doesn't include, unless someone requests the full chain, is the attachment. And Warren Fitch hasn't requested the full chain." "He'll find it eventually," Claire said. "Yes," I said.
"He will."
She looked at me for another moment and then wrote something in her own notepad. The morning of the hearing, Desmond arrived with Pauline and Warren Fitch. They sat at their table with the organized calm of people who have already decided how a story ends. Pauline's cream blouse, Warren's suit, Desmond's careful, neutral expression that I had once mistaken for steadiness and had later understood was simply absence. Judge Alcorn moved through the preliminary matters efficiently. Warren Fitch presented their argument. Claire presented ours, briefly, without flourish, handing over the complete deed package, and asking only that the court take time to review all recorded attachments before finalizing the transfer. Warren Fitch accepted the package without looking at it. When the judge asked if I consented to the transfer, I said yes. When the clerk slid the signature page across, I signed it. I set the pen down. I folded my hands in my lap and felt, for the first time in 14 months, entirely still. Desmond's jaw unclenched. Pauline exhaled. Warren Fitch gathered the documents, stacked them neatly, and did not read them. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the February air hit my face like cold water, sharp, clarifying. I could hear Pauline's voice behind me, bright with relief, telling Desmond they should go to lunch. She said, "That was the easiest thing I've ever watched," and she laughed, a short, certain sound, the kind that doesn't need an audience. My mother appeared at my left shoulder. She didn't say anything. She took my hand, briefly, and squeezed it once. I looked at the paper grocery bag she was still carrying and thought about the yellow legal pad in my own bag, 47 pages, water-stained cover. Every repair and every date and every winter I had put into that house written out in my own handwriting. I thought about the word maintenance. I thought about document CR 4471, B, sitting at the bottom of Warren Fitch's document stack, unread. I didn't smile. I didn't say anything. I just walked down the courthouse steps in my flat shoes, one step at a time, and felt the cold settle into the collar of my blazer, and let it. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, Claire called. I was at my desk at Caldwell County Abstract, reviewing a title search on a commercial parcel off Route 9. I set the file down. I picked up the phone. Claire said 2 sentences. I wrote them on the yellow legal pad. I capped the pen. I set it down parallel to the pad's edge. I looked at the sentences for a long moment. I closed the pad. I put on my coat. I walked to my car in the lot behind the office. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for one crow on the fence post at the lot's far end. I watched it for a while. Then I started the car. Claire had said 2 sentences. The first was, "Warren Fitch called me this morning." The second was, "He finally read the attachment." I drove home from the abstract office on a route I had taken 5,000 times, down Porter Street, left on Crestline, past the hardware store where Desmond and I had bought the tile grout for the bathroom floor on a Saturday morning 6 years ago, past the elementary school, past the church with the broken gutter I had noticed every winter for 9 years, and I thought about those 2 sentences the entire way. I thought about Warren Fitch, sitting at his desk, working through the deed package in the aftermath of what he had assumed was a closed matter. I thought about the moment he would have reached the final attachment. I thought about the particular quality of silence that descends on a person when they understand, all at once, that they have made a consequential error. I had sat in that silence myself, professionally, on behalf of other people's mistakes. I knew its texture. I parked in my driveway. The house was not Crestline Drive. I was renting a small 2-bedroom on Aldermore Lane, 6 blocks away, that I had moved into the month after Desmond filed. It had a narrow kitchen and a back window that looked onto a neighbor's oak tree, and I had been telling myself it was temporary for 14 months. I went inside. I set my bag on the kitchen table. I took out the yellow legal pad and opened it to the page where I had written Claire's 2 sentences. Then I took out the folder my mother had given me, the one from the paper grocery bag, now worn at the corners from how many times I had opened and closed it, and I set it on the table beside the pad. I looked at them both for a moment. Then I reached in. The folder was manila, standard weight, the kind sold in bulk at any office supply store. My mother had labeled it in her handwriting, neat, unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had spent 22 years writing file numbers in the margins of county documents. The label said only, CR 4471B. I took it out. The document inside was 4 pages. I had read it so many times that the first page had begun to show a faint crease along the center fold, the way pages do when they have been opened and refolded by the same hands in the same place repeatedly. I unfolded it slowly, spreading it flat on the kitchen table, smoothing the crease with the side of my hand. I laid it flat. The language of a restrictive covenant is not dramatic. It does not use the vocabulary of triumph or loss. It is methodical, referential, built from subordinate clauses that loop back on themselves like a road that knows exactly where it is going. This one was 4 pages of exactly that: property descriptions, legal references, grantee and grantor language, recording information. And buried in the 3rd paragraph of the 2nd page, in the same plain font as everything around it, was the clause that mattered. It read, in substance, that the property described herein could not be conveyed, transferred, encumbered, or otherwise alienated without the express written consent of both named parties to this instrument, or, in the event of the incapacity or unwillingness of either party, their designated successor in interest, said successor being identified herein as Dorothea Alma Mensa of Fenwick Road, Hargrove, Ohio. My mother's full name, her address, recorded in the public record 4 years before any of this began. I had asked her, the week after I found the document, when she had done it. "The month after you bought the house," she said. "Why didn't you tell me?" She considered this for a moment. "Because I hoped you'd never need to know," she said. "And because if you knew, you might have felt like I didn't trust the marriage. And I didn't want you to carry that." I had not known what to say to that. I still don't, entirely. What I know is this. My mother had watched me build something over 9 years, and she had quietly, without announcement, done the one thing that her 22 years in the county records office had equipped her to do. She had created a paper wall. Not a visible one. Not the kind anyone would trip over in the course of a standard transaction. The kind you only find if you pull the complete chain. Warren Fitch had not pulled the complete chain. Claire called me that evening with the full picture. Warren had contacted her in the early afternoon. He had, she said, been thorough in reviewing the attachment once he reached it. He understood exactly what it meant. He had then called Desmond. He had then, presumably, called Pauline. "What did he say?" I asked. "He said the transfer is, in his words, legally defective," Claire said. "The covenant requires your mother's written consent. She hasn't given it. Until she does, the transfer can't be completed." "And if she doesn't give it," I said, "then Desmond doesn't get a clean title. He can't sell it. He can't refinance it. He can't do anything with it that requires a lender or a buyer to do their own title search, which is everything." I wrote this down on the legal pad. "Warren wants a meeting," Claire said. "I know he does," I said. There was a pause on the line. I could hear her moving something, a chair, a file folder, the particular sounds of an attorney's office at the end of a long day. "Renata," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it the way you would answer a document question, not an emotional one." "All right," I said. "Did you know about this covenant before you found document CR 4471 be in the title chain?" "No," I said. "And when you found it, in month 6 of proceedings, pulling the chain yourself, what did you do?" "I called Gerald Hutchins," I said. "I paid him $1,850 to confirm it was valid and would survive transfer. Then I brought the document to my mother and asked her about it. And she confirmed she was the designated successor." "Yes." "And at that point," Claire said, "you made a decision about how to proceed." "I made a decision about what to show Warren Fitch and what not to show him," I said. "The covenant was always in the public record. I didn't conceal anything. I simply declined to point out information that opposing counsel had not specifically requested." Another pause. "That distinction," Claire said, "is going to matter a great deal." "I know," I said. "That's why I wrote it down." "Warren wants a meeting," she said again. "Schedule it," I said. "And tell him Gerald Hutchins is available to attend if he wants to talk through the drafting history." I heard her write something. "I'll call you in the morning," she said. "Good night, Claire," I said. I set the phone down on the kitchen table next to the legal pad. The overhead light in the narrow kitchen made everything look very still and clear. I looked at the 2 sentences I had written when she first called, and then I looked at the 3 pages of notes I had added since. I closed the pad. I called my mother. "She hasn't given her consent yet?" My mother said. "Not yet," I said. "Are you going to ask her to?" "When it matters," I said. "Not before." A short silence on her end. "Are you eating?" she said. "I had something," I said. Come for dinner Thursday, she said. I'll make the rice. All right, I said.
Good night then, she said. Good night, Mom, I said.
I hung up and sat at the table for a while longer, and then I washed my coffee cup and went to bed and slept for the first time in 3 days without waking before 4. The meeting was held 9 days later in Claire's office on Porter Street. Desmond came with Warren Fitch. Pauline came with Desmond. My mother came with me. In the elevator on the way up, my mother stood beside me with a grocery bag folded under her arm. She had brought it again, out of habit or perhaps out of something closer to ritual, and she looked straight at the elevator doors and did not say anything. I looked at the doors too. When they opened, I let her walk out first. Pauline's cream blouse was the same one she had worn to the hearing. I noticed this the way I notice details in documents, not with feeling, just with registration. Warren Fitch opened by acknowledging that the deed package had contained a recorded instrument that had not been identified during his title review. He used the phrase, an oversight in the scope of our preliminary search. He said it evenly, professionally, the way people in his position say things they have practiced saying. Desmond looked at the table. Pauline looked at my mother. Dorothea, she said, and her voice had the warmth she deployed when she needed something. I think we can all agree that this document, whatever it says, wasn't intended to create an obstacle. Renata's family has always been welcome here. We've always considered this a family matter. My mother looked at her. My mother did not say anything. There was a silence in that room that had weight to it. We thought it would be better for everyone, Pauline continued, if we could resolve this without further proceedings. Desmond worked hard for that house. You both know that. And I think, if we're being honest, the down payment, I said, is addressed in the appraisal. Claire has the full documentation.
Pauline turned to me.
Her expression rearranged itself into something that resembled patience. Renata, I just think. You said this was the easiest thing you'd ever watched, I said. She stopped. I looked at her. I kept my voice level, the way I keep it when I am reading a document I already know the outcome of. And you told me, over my own kitchen table, that you'd always worried I wasn't ready for marriage. And you told this room, today, that you've always considered this a family matter. She opened her mouth and closed it. Desmond's hand on the table beside her was very still. The document you haven't read yet, I said, has been in the public record for 4 years. It was filed on the same day as the deed. It is attached to the deed. It is not a surprise. It is not a trick. It is exactly the kind of instrument that anyone conducting a thorough title search would have found on the first pass. Warren Fitch's expression had gone to the particular flatness of a professional who has received bad news and is managing his response. I reached into the folder on the table in front of me. I took out a single sheet, a copy of CR 4471B, the relevant paragraph highlighted, and I set it on the table between us. That oversight, I said, using Warren Fitch's own phrase back at him, will take some time to undo. Warren looked at the sheet. He did not pick it up. Pauline's hand moved to the pearls at her throat. Desmond, for the first time since the deposition, looked directly at me. His eyes had the expression of someone who has just understood something they should have understood much earlier and cannot decide what to do with that understanding. Warren Fitch cleared his throat. Ms. Osei, I want to be clear that our position is not that the covenant is necessarily invalid. We are simply in the early stages of reviewing. Gerald Hutchins drafted it, Claire said, from her side of the table. He's reviewed his own work. He's available to discuss it if you'd like a second conversation. Warren Fitch looked at Claire. Something shifted behind his expression, a small, careful recalibration. We'll be in touch, he said. Of course, Claire said. I picked up the folder. I did not slam it on the table. I did not raise my voice. I stood, pushed in my chair with both hands, and walked to the door. My mother stood and followed me. We left without slamming anything. In the hallway, my mother took my arm, and we walked to the elevator and rode it down in silence. On the ground floor, she held the lobby door for me, and we walked out into the pale afternoon light of Porter Street and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. You did well, she said. You did well first, I said. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close to one. We walked to her car. She drove me home. What happened after is less dramatic than what happened before, which is usually how it goes with property law. Warren Fitch spent 6 weeks attempting to construct a legal argument that the covenant could be invalidated on procedural grounds. Gerald Hutchins, who had drafted it, spent those same 6 weeks being entirely unmoved by this argument. The covenant had been recorded correctly. The legal description matched. The successor designation was unambiguous. There was no procedural irregularity to attack. In the end, Desmond did not get a clean title. What he got instead was a renegotiated settlement, reached 4 months after the meeting in Claire's office. The house was listed and sold, jointly, with both our signatures, as the covenant required, for $391,000. After the mortgage payoff and closing costs, the net equity was divided according to a formula that Claire and Warren Fitch negotiated over 3 weeks of back-and-forth correspondence. My share reflected 11 years of mortgage payments, 11 years of maintenance, and 11 years of a life I had built in that house with my own hands. It was not a fantasy number. It was a fair one, which, if you have spent any time in property records, you know is rarer than it sounds. Pauline did not attend the closing. Desmond came alone, sat across the table from me and my attorney, and signed where he was asked to sign. He did not look at me during the signing. When it was finished, he gathered his copy of the documents, said thank you to the title company representative, and left. At the door, he paused. He turned back toward me briefly and said, "I'm sorry it went the way it did." I looked at him for a moment. His face had the expression I remembered from the early years of our marriage, open, a little uncertain, the expression he wore before Pauline's accounting entered every room ahead of him. "So am I," I said. And I meant it. Not as a concession. Not as forgiveness, exactly. Just as a fact. We had built something real and we had lost it, and that loss was genuinely a loss, regardless of how the paperwork came out in the end. He nodded once and left. I stayed at the table until the title company rep had organized all the documents. I accepted my copy of the closing package. I put it in my bag, next to the yellow legal pad. Then I drove to my mother's house on Fenwick Road and sat at her kitchen table and ate the lunch she had made without being asked, the way she always fed me when something important had just concluded, and I told her the number. She nodded once, the way she nods when a file has been properly closed. "Good," she said. "Thank you," I said. She poured more tea and did not make it into anything larger than it was. The lease on my rental on Aldermore Lane ran through March. I stayed through April, just to give myself room. In May, I made an offer on a house 2 towns over, in a county where I did not know the clerks by first name and where the property records were someone else's responsibility. The closing was uneventful. I pulled the full title chain myself, out of habit, and found nothing unexpected. I moved in on a Saturday with my mother's help and 3 trips in a borrowed truck. The kitchen is smaller than Crestline Drive. The porch needs painting. The furnace is old but functional, and the previous owner left a note taped to the utility room wall listing every repair made in the past decade with dates and costs, which I found so moving I nearly couldn't throw it away. I kept it. It is taped inside the cover of a new legal pad. I still have the yellow one. 47 pages, water-stained cover. Every repair and every winter I put into a house that is no longer mine. I don't keep it as a grievance. I keep it as a record. That house was real. What I built there was real. The fact that it ended doesn't change that. My mother still works at Hargrove County Deeds and Records. She still knows every document number by function. She still brings food without being asked and sets it on whatever table is nearest. She is the reason I know that the most important documents are almost never the ones people read first. That is the thing I want you to take from this story, not the reversal, not the covenant, not the number at the closing table. The thing I want you to take is this: the people who build quietly, who document carefully, who do the unglamorous work of understanding what they have actually signed, those are the people whose foundations hold. Pauline understood acquisition. She understood down payments and equity claims, and the vocabulary of ownership. What she did not understand was the difference between a headline and an article, between a deed and a chain, between what you sign and what is attached to it. Most losses don't announce themselves. They're buried on the second page. That's my story. I signed my name in a Caldwell County courtroom on a Tuesday morning in February, wearing my work blazer and flat shoes, with a water-stained legal pad in my bag and a manila folder my mother had carried from her filing cabinet. I watched Pauline laugh on the courthouse steps. I sat in my car 6 blocks away and looked at a crow on a fence post until I was ready to start the engine. Those are the 3 things I will remember longest: the flat shoes, the crow, and my mother's handwriting on a folder that said nothing except a document number. If any part of this story spoke to you, if you have ever signed something you were told you had no choice but to sign, or built something you were told wasn't yours, the full chain is always worth pulling. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. I read them. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.